Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, Isis, Escape from Transylvania. The goddess next door and John Haynes must escape a horde of vampires on the hunt in this horror-filled Isis series adventure. Get Isis, Escape from Transylvania in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today. I was watching a Diversity in Comics video and he was talking about Milestone Comics. And in the video where he was talking about Milestone Comics, he called them blackety black, blacker than black comics, and said that because he believed that they were blackety black, blacker than black comics, this was one of his reasons for not reading them actively. Now, as someone who has gone out and purchased Milestone Comics while he was in college, I can tell you that Milestone Comics were not these blackety black, blacker than black comics, and that Milestone Comics gave us one of the most balanced pictures of the black community ever presented in a comic book. And the reason why Milestone Comics gave us one of the most balanced pictures of the black community in a comic book is because we finally had a comic book universe primarily created by a group of black comic creators, and these group of black comic creators was going to make an effort, to give us the most fair and balanced picture of African American communities, African American life, and the African American experience in between the pages of a comic book. Now, when it comes down to black superheroes, primarily before Milestone was founded, we got most of our views of black superheroes through a white lens. And what I mean by a white lens is we got black characters who were primarily created by white comics creators. And when you look at characters like your Black Panther, your Luke Cage, and your Falcon, again, these were characters who were created by white men, and they were giving us a view of black men through the eyes of a white man. So we were getting a black character, but we were getting a black character based on ideas and perceptions of white men. So when we look at a Power Man or a Falcon or a Black Panther, we're not really getting the experience of a black man from a black man's view. We're getting the experience of a black man from a white man's view. And that was something I always noticed when I was reading Iron Man comics back in the 80s with Jim Rhodes. Now, I was very happy to see Jim Rhodes in Iron Man comics, but oftentimes, again, I didn't know that this was a black character from a white perspective. It wasn't until I got older and I started to understand the difference between a black character from a white perspective and a black character from a black perspective. And I learned that as I was watching filmmakers like Spike Lee and Robert Townsend growing up in high school, when I would watch Spike Lee films like Do the Right Thing, School Days, and Robert Townsend's Hollywood Shuffle. And those films really gave me some perspective on the difference between black from a black lens and black from a white lens, because we get a completely different story when you have black creators going out here and creating their own characters and telling stories about the African American experience. And that's what Milestone was all about. Many of these black comic pros believed that they were not getting an opportunity to go out and tell stories the way they wanted to about the black experience, and they weren't being able to present a balanced picture. Yes, there were black superheroes in comics, like your Black Lightnings, like your Luke Cages, like your Black Panthers, like your Falcons, like your Storms, but we always saw them within the context of the white heroes. Moreover, we also had black comic pros who were working in the industry, like your Keith Pollards, like your Dennis Cowans, like your Mark D. Brights, like your Dwayne McDuffies, and they would get work on comics, but they really weren't getting an opportunity to go out here and shine, and they really weren't getting the notice and acknowledgement that they really deserved for their work. I can remember Mark D. Bright, who was the penciler of Iron Man during the Armor Wars, and not that many people knew that Mark D. Bright was a black artist. I mean, no one knew that Mark Bright was a black artist, just like many people didn't know that Keith Pollard, who had a legendary Spider-Man run, was a black artist. And your Keith Pollard was the guy who went out here and created the Black Cat, but no one will really talk about, Keith Pollard or Mark D. Bright, and no one really talks about Dwayne McDuffie and his legendary contributions to not only the Marvel Universe with the damage control, but also by literally saving DC by creating and writing many of those Justice League and Justice League Unlimited episodes that led to an entire generation remembering who the DC superheroes were. And many people don't want to talk about guys like Daryl Banks, who created Kyle Rayner and created his iconic crab mask and gauntlet costume that was a part of a almost 100 or so issue run of Green Lantern. And no one really wanted to talk about many of these black comic pros and the contributions they have made over the years. And that's one of the reasons why they went out in the 90s and talked about forming this Milestone company, and formed that Milestone company in the 1990s. Because when it comes down to black comic pros, again, they don't get the credit that they're due, and they didn't get the credit that they deserved at the big two. And many of these guys, again, had been toiling at many of these companies for many years, and they really didn't get the opportunities that they believed they deserved. And they really didn't get an opportunity to tell the stories that they wanted to tell. And that was one of the reasons why they went out here and formed Milestone Comics. And Milestone Comics was a milestone for many people who were black comic fans. Now, black comic fans like myself, we saw what was great about this company. I remember being in college, and I remember hearing about these comics coming out in the New York Daily News, and I was really excited for these comics to come out, because I understood that when it came down to black superheroes, we really don't get that many opportunities, and the ones that we do get, you know, they were few and far between. I mean, in 1993, Power Man had been canceled for about 10 years or so, and they were coming out with a new Cage series, but that one wasn't as great as the Milestone one. And at the time, we had I think it was 93, was Cage, we had Deathlock, and we had, those were coming out of Marvel, and that was what was coming out at the time. And then Milestone came around, and I went out and bought all 4 of the books when they came out. I bought all the #1 issues, and I read all 4 of the #1 issues. And again, as a guy who read most of the Milestone books, I can tell you there was no blackety black, blacker than black in Milestone Comics. When it came down to Milestone Comics, we really got a very diverse picture of black culture and black life, because all 4 of these characters, they represented different parts of the black community. Now, your Hardware, when he came out, he was representing all those brothers who worked in corporate America. He was not a black Iron Man. He really was one of these black men out here who thought he could work his way up on merit. He thought he could earn his way in white corporate America. And what led to him becoming Hardware was he had trusted this Edwin Alva like a father. He thought this Edwin Alva was going to look out for him. But when Edwin Alva told him that he had no value, that's when your Curtis Metcalf got angry and decided to go out here and create the Hardware. And he wanted to make this Edwin Alva pay for what he had done to him in not giving him his due, because he felt that, you know, he had earned his way through working at this company. He'd given this company many inventions, and he felt that he deserved an equal share of the profits on the inventions he made for this company. So when I look at your Curtis Metcalf, I understand his story, because I experienced his story myself, and I experienced his story with other black people. So I know where the Curtis Metcalf character was coming from, and I know that your Hardware wasn't a black Iron Man. He was a brilliant inventor, and what he wanted to do was get justice and just compensation for his work. So I understood where that character was coming from, because it came from the experience of working class black men who were told they could go out here, get this education, get this job, and they would be given an equal opportunity. However, when it was time to rise to another level or get fair and just compensation for their work, they were told a completely different story by white men like Edwin Alva. And that's a story that black men who work in corporate America experience every day. And we experience it not only with white men, but we also experience it with elitist black men. Now, Icon was a completely different story from Hardware, and the Icon story, which many people want to call Black Superman and dismiss it as Black Superman, is a lot more complex than most people would believe. Now, your Icon was a guy, he was a brother from another planet. He wound up trying to help people escape this ship that was getting ready to blow up. And the ship, his escape pod, took him all the way down in the 1800s to a part of a slave plantation. And the woman who found him raised him up, and he wound up learning about white supremacy and racism and slavery. And he fought in the Civil War, and he fought against Jim Crow and racism. And when the Icon character, he was all about black people learning about black history, but the whole thing with the Icon character was he was one of these black conservatives, and he was disconnecting himself from the world because he was alien to the world and he didn't understand what things meant to people. But with the character Raquel Irvin, who becomes the Rocket, she's the one who connects him to the world and lets him understand that he has to use his power to help out his community. And that's what led to the origins of Icon and Rocket. And from the Icon comic, one of the reasons I liked the Icon comic was I got inspiration for the creation of ISIS back in 1999. Now, this book came out in 93, but as I was reading it again, I said, this is a great story, and I got some ideas for the ISIS character, who is a, at the time, 1900-year-old goddess, and she's the last of the goddesses, and she's living in America, and she's experienced racism and Jim Crow, and that's where I got the idea for the ISIS character experiencing racism and Jim Crow and the horrific tragedy that led to her becoming a prisoner of the gods, her literally breaking down mentally and emotionally after she watches her husband get lynched and her son get murdered. And that's where I got the idea for that, from reading Icon, because Icon was about the experiences that black men go through with slavery and racism, and this man reconnecting with his community after being so detached from his community and having this conservative view, but him coming to understand that he has to come in and be a symbol for those in his community and then teach those about their history. And I really liked Icon except for one point, and that one point was when they made the Raquel Irvin character a single mother. I always felt that the Icon book could have really blown up had they just made it about this Raquel learning from Augustus Freeman. But what they did, the big mistake was, in the second issue, was announced that Raquel Irvin was pregnant. And that's where the book, as I saw it, jumped the shark, because this was a chance for us to really see a strong, intelligent black sister, rise up and take herself to the next level. But when they put that single mother narrative in the book, it really threw the book off and prevented it from actualizing its potential. Now, the third book that I bought was The Blood Syndicate. And The Blood Syndicate was a book about a street gang. We got a completely different view of street gangs than what we got in television and media, because in most television and media, we always see the street gang as the bad guys. But in Blood Syndicate, we saw the street gang as the heroes, and they were looking to protect their Paris Island from these predators, and that we got a really interesting picture of it. And the whole Blood Syndicate really had an impact on the Milestone universe, because the Holocaust character, he was this guy who was becoming this, powerful guy who had all these connections and all this power, and he was a real credible threat to many of the characters in the Milestone universe, from Hardware to Icon to Static. And he was a real tough guy. I mean, he was a real piece of work, and he was one of the big villains in the Milestone universe. And he was really one of the more credible threats in the Milestone universe, because he was a guy who was built up over time in the books. But the Blood Syndicate book, when it first came out, was one of the strongest books in the Milestone universe, but it started to fall apart over time. And one of the reasons why it started to fall apart over time is because they started adding characters into the Blood Syndicate that really weren't a good fit, like the Quiet character and the Boogeyman character. They started out interesting, but then they started to fall apart. And the Masquerade character, they really didn't develop her the way they should have developed her, and the book started to lose direction. Now, the fourth book, which is the one everybody knows, is the Static book. And Static was literally like Milestone's Spider-Man. He was a teenager who got superpowers, and he was always having fun in his action and adventure. And his part was to represent, those middle-class young brothers out there who came from middle-class lifestyles. And that was a story we really weren't getting told in many comic books. In many comic books, we never really got the story of the middle-class kid who was the comic fan, the sci-fi fan, the fantasy fan. And Virgil Hawkins was the middle-class kid who was the comic fan, the sci-fi fan, the fantasy fan, and he was the average, everyday kid out there. And that story really resonated with people because a lot of kids who were my age at the time, they resonated with them because they saw themselves in the Virgil character. And then with the Static, that's why he was so popular, because he was just like every other kid out there, and you could identify and relate with him. And his book was one of the best books in the entire Milestone line. I would always rank it as, Static, Icon, Hardware, and Blood Syndicate as ranking them in terms of quality, because all four books, again, they were very good compared to a lot of black comics that were coming out at the time. And in the 1990s, there were a lot of black comics out there other than Milestone. At the time, we also had Cage coming out from Marvel. We also had Deathlock coming out from Marvel. And Deathlock was actually one of the first black superheroes to come out in the 1990s, because his book started with one of those, I forget what they're called. They're like these hardbound books. Like they're hard paper, they're soft paperback, but they have like a hard spine. And the new Deathlock was Michael Collins, this black man who had his brain put into a cyborg, and at the time it was one of the most popular comics at the time. However, it was one of those comics, again, about a black character who was created by a white man. And they also had launched Cage at the same time. And we also had, in addition to Cage and Deathlock, around 93 we started to see, or 94, we had the War Machine comic come out around the second year of Milestone. So we had about 3 or 4 black characters featured in comics. And we also had the Night Thrasher series coming out from Marvel as well. And on the DC side, we had a new Black Lightning series come out. So we had a lot of black comics coming out in the 90s. And that's why I can say Milestone really wasn't blackety black, blacker than black comics. And when I take a look at Milestone, it was really middle of the road compared to many of the comics. And the quality of Milestone was a lot higher than many of the other comics produced by Marvel and DC at the time, because DC was also, in addition to producing Black Lightning, they had also launched a Steel series. And I had read many of these books, and I could tell you that there was a major difference in quality. The Milestone universe, for the most part, the books were primarily high quality from the ones that I had been reading, but there were some of these Marvel books that featured black heroes where the quality was really questionable. And one of the books that was really questionable was the new Cage series. I really wanted to get into the new Cage series, but it just never really came together. And one of the reasons why it never really came together was because of the writing. I mean, this new direction for Luke Cage, it just didn't really fit the character, and it didn't really flow organically. And another book that was really terrible was War Machine. I mean, War Machine, people talk about SJW Marvel. War Machine was SJW Marvel before SJW Marvel. And the War Machine book had really terrible writing. The Jim Rose character really never got developed. They introduced a lesbian character into the book, and the action was really flat. And I remember reading War Machine, and it just never really came together. It really just felt like something really slapped together. In 93, I was sitting there going, this book is just not very good. And I liked Jim Rhodes as War Machine when Len Kamenetsky was writing him in the Iron Man comic, but in his own book, it just didn't work. And one of the reasons why it didn't work is because Jim Rhodes was never an inventor, and Jim Rhodes could not create, inventions in the way that Iron Man could create inventions. And it didn't work because the War Machine suit was primarily a gimmick, and it didn't really help the Jim Rhodes character develop or grow in any way, shape, or form. in the Iron Man books he was in, yeah, he was great because he was filling in for Tony Stark. But when you read Iron Man, it's all about Tony Stark. And the problem with Jim Rhodes is he's a very two-dimensional character, and he really didn't go past that level. Now, Night Thrasher was a fairly decent comic, but again, it wasn't on the Milestone level in terms of storytelling. So it was okay, but it wasn't there. I mean, he was like, in some ways, like Tony Stark. He had his armor, and he had, you know, a good power set, but his rogues gallery really didn't work. And one of the things that you need for a comic to make it work is a strong rogues gallery. And a lot of these black heroes, their big problem when I was reading them in the 90s was they did not have that strong rogues gallery to really help them out. Now, Milestone characters, on the other hand, quite a few of them had very strong rogues galleries. And Static had the strongest rogues gallery because he was always taking on a new villain every issue or every other issue, while other characters, they kind of struggled because they just didn't really focus on the bad guys. But when the Milestone creators created a lot of this, they really were focused on a hero-centered universe. Now, as a writer myself, I always start out with the bad guys because I know that bad guys drive conflict and bad guys really make the story interesting. And that's something that Milestone was one of their Achilles' heels, was they made great heroes, but they just didn't really focus too well on the rogues galleries. And that was one of the reasons why I believe that they had a lot of troubles later on as they were, progressing, because they just didn't build that big bad guy outside of Holocaust that anybody could consider a credible threat that would really define the Milestone universe. Now, as a comic fan myself and a writer myself, I always, again, focus on the bad guys when I'm doing stories because I know that the bad guys are going to be the draw. But the Milestone creators, they thought that they could go and create the heroes first, but you really have to create the villain. And that was one of the lessons I learned, reading their comics back in the 1990s when I was in college, was to start with the villain. And that's when I was creating ISIS, I started with E-Steam first, then I brought ISIS in, and that's why the story was really dynamic, because I created villains who would be a credible threat and be somebody that the hero could overcome. And that's one of the lessons I learned from Milestone Comics. But Milestone Comics, again, they were not these blackety-black, blacker than black comic books. When it comes down to Milestone, if you read a Milestone comic, you will see it as just another comic book world with superheroes. However, it's only a comic book world that features African American superheroes in their own African American universe. And in that universe, we are getting the most diverse picture of African American life and African American culture overall. Because when you look at the Milestone universe and you compare it to the Marvel universe, you're getting almost the same thing as the Marvel universe and the DC universe. However, you're only seeing a world, again, that features black heroes, and they're heroes from a black perspective. Now, in order to understand why Milestone was really middle of the road, you have to look at comics from a panoramic perspective. And again, I can look at it from the Marvel side and the DC side, where I saw characters like Deathlock, Steel, War Machine getting their own books, and Black Lightning getting their own books. But I could also see the independent side. And on the independent side, there were a lot of books that would be considered blackety-black, blacker than black comics that featured pro-black perspectives. And a lot of those indie books, like your Captain Africa's, those are the books that featured a lot of this pro-black narratives and this evil white man narratives. Those were the books that came out in the 90s. And those books were featured in articles in the New York Daily News. I remember them not only talking about Milestone Comics in the New York Daily News, but they also talked about a company called Unia, which featured black heroes, and they also talked about Captain Africa in the New York Daily News at the time. And they also talked about black comics in Upscale magazine in the 1990s as well. And I remember my sister, who was going to college at the time, she brought back an Upscale magazine, and they had an entire article featuring all of these black comics, from a book called L.A. Phoenix to a book called Hip Hop Heaven to a book called Flatbush Native. There were all sorts of black comics out there. And again, we were getting a very diverse picture of African American culture, African American experience, and African American life in those comic books, and we weren't just getting one view of black life as related to black comics. I mean, Milestone was just one of many publishers that came out during the 1990s as related to creating black comics at the time, but there were numerous black publishers who came out with comics during the 1990s. The 1990s, again, was a boom period for comics, and we had a lot of black comic pros out there producing work in the early 1990s. Things didn't really start to decline until the mid-90s as related to the comic book industry, because we had the speculator boom go bust, and then we had a lot of publishers, they lost a lot of places to distribute comics because of what happened with Heroes World and Marvel, and we also saw a lot of comic shops close, and that was also part of the collapse of the industry. So a lot of these companies, they wound up going out of business because they lost their distribution deals, because a lot of distributors started going down, and then a lot of the sales started going down. So we started to see these companies really start to decline at the time. So when it comes down to diversity, there was a lot of diversity in the 90s as related to the black image, and there was a lot of diversity as related to black comics, and there was Milestone Comics. Again, these Milestone Comics, they were not the blackety black, blacker than black as presented in the media. They were middle of the road, and they gave us really the most balanced and diverse picture of black heroes you would ever see in a comic book. Now, most people, like diversity in comics, they're used to the black characters who come from white people, but they're not used to seeing black characters that come from black creators. And when you read a comic that's featured in a black hero by a black creator, you're going to get a completely different story than that from a white creator, because the white creator is coming from what he sees on the outside about the black community, whereas the black creator is coming from the inside and is telling you what he knows from living in the black community, experiencing life in the black community, and he's telling you a story from what he has seen, known, and heard, and also heard from others, and knows from his own life experience, because he lives in the black community. He can give you the most balanced picture of the black community. As a black creator myself, I know that I can give readers pictures of the black community that are going to be completely different than what you would get at a Marvel from a Black Panther or a Luke Cage, or even one of these other characters like Night Thrasher, because my experience is completely different. A character like a John Haynes or an Isis or an Easting, they're going to have a completely different view of life, and they're going to give the reader a completely different view of life from their stories and the experiences they give to the reader in their stories. Like when I do a John Haynes, I'm talking about a black CEO, because when he's coming from the perspective of a black man being in a CEO position, and from the perspective of someone who has experienced racism in corporate America and understands how corporate America works. So I'm going to give you a different picture of what a black CEO means and how important it is. And with the Isis character, I'm giving you a experience from the perspective of a black goddess who is living in America, who has experienced America, both good and bad, both experiencing the racism in America, but also experiencing black culture in America. And that's not a perspective you're going to get from a white writer. A white writer wouldn't understand those perspectives of life. They wouldn't understand the perspective of a black woman and how she lives life in America. They wouldn't understand the neighborhood, they wouldn't understand the culture, they wouldn't understand the experience, and they wouldn't understand those things because they haven't lived here and they haven't experienced it. I mean, you can do research on things and it'll give you some perspective on things, but you really have to live there to really get it. And that's one of the things I put in a lot of my work, like John Haynes and Isis and Easting, and even books like Spinsterella and Spellbound. It's like, give you that picture, and that picture allows you to see the world from the black perspective. Because when it came down to doing the African American Goth perspective I put in the Spinsterella trilogy, I really had to think about, my experiences growing up in places like the South Bronx and visiting places with my father in Harlem and, you know, those neighborhoods and bringing those neighborhoods to life. And that's something you would get from, again, a black comic pro in a black comic book. And that doesn't make it a blackety blacker than black comic. It gives you a richer and broader picture of your country, of the world, and the world that you experience it in. Now, when it comes down to many of these pro-blacks, they're going to give you, like, your Kwanzars and your Ta-Nehisi coats. They're going to give you a picture of things, but a lot of times their picture is often skewed because they're trying to push one narrative regarding the black community. But that narrative, again, is one that is meant to make white people feel comfortable and give you black through a white lens. Whereas with Milestone, they were trying to give you black through a black lens, and they were trying to give you a balanced picture of black through a black lens, a humanized picture of black through a black lens, and show you that there is more than one viewpoint as related to the black community, and more than one culture in the black community, and more than one way of life in the black community. And that was one of the things that made Milestone one of the great companies out there, was that it gave us those multiple viewpoints of black life and black culture. And one of the things that made it really great was it was one of those places where we got to see these black comic pros making efforts towards actualizing their potential, because guys like Dwayne McDuffie, guys like Dennis Cowan, guys like Mark D. Bright, guys like Chris Cross, and many others, they wouldn't have really gotten an opportunity to actualize their potential really in a place like a Marvel or a DC, because when it comes down to many black comic pros, they oftentimes, for years, they don't get the opportunities that they deserve to have. And I often look at the comic book industry right now, which talks about, like, companies like Marvel talking about diversity, but when it comes down to the black comic pros, I don't see a lot of black comic pros, you know, getting those opportunities like they did back in the 90s when the industry was really strong. I mean, I have not seen another guy like Daryl Banks get a 100-issue run on a major character like Green Lantern like he had in the 90s. I have not seen, you know, many comic book writers that are black get opportunities, you know, to really shine in this industry. I really haven't seen a guy like Mark D. Bright get an opportunity to have a run on a major story like Armor Wars like he had back in the 1980s. I mean, I have not seen black comic pros in 2018 getting the opportunities they had in the 80s and the 90s to start really showing their potential. And I really have not seen anyone, you know, come up to the Dwayne McDuffie level where you're literally writing the television series Justice League and Justice League Unlimited and doing such a great job that it literally becomes a cornerstone for the DC brand. I mean, when you look at Justice League and Justice League Unlimited, you can clearly see Dwayne McDuffie's legacy right there, and with his creation of the Static Shock cartoon, his legacy up there with legends like Matt Baker, the first black comic book artist. And again, those opportunities really don't come for black comic pros like they should. And when I look at, you know, Milestone, it wasn't a blacker than black comic book company, and they didn't create these blacker than black heroes. The media wanted to present it that way, but those of us who went out here and bought those comics and read those comics, we understood what that was there. That was one of the few opportunities we had to present a positive image of African Americans, a diverse image of African Americans, a balanced image of African Americans, and a humanized image of African Americans in media. And it was one of the inspirations that led to me, you know, having the inspiration to go out here and create characters like your Isis, your Eastine, your John Haynes. That was all due partially to Milestone Comics, and the other part was seeing Sally Richardson and Keith David in Gargoyles, and seeing those black people being a part of a fantasy world and contributing to fantasy. That was one of those things that influenced me and had an impact on me, and showed me that you can create a universe of diverse characters who are African American, and that universe could succeed in the world, in the marketplace. And when I look at Milestone, again, they weren't these super blackety black characters. They were an opportunity for black people to present a story based on their experience, their ideas, and their image of selves in the same way I go out here and try to present you with our image and the image of black people in books like the SJS Direct imprint. And if you want to try the books of the SJS Direct imprint, like the ISIS series, the E-Steam series, The Temptation of John Haynes, and the Spinsterella trilogy, you may do so by clicking the link to Amazon.com in the description box. And if you want to see me make more videos like this, you can donate to my Patreon by clicking the link in the description box. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available in paperback and e-readers, E-Steam Ascension, The Devil's Diva reaches a turning point in her life with this powerful E-Steam series story. Get E-Steam Ascension at online booksellers today.